Okay, take two. Welcome to Critical Weight Theory. And this is episode 666 of my little podcast here. So it's a little bit of a special episode. I technically have 762 episodes overall. If you look at the YouTube thing of this podcast, but those are like special episodes that I have in the mix, including the Quadruple D, which is a politically charged show within a show. So this is the officially designated episode 666, and I'm talking about something relevant to that number. Now, I did have a sort of debate over what I was going to cover for episode 666. I had plenty of options for that topic. I could have covered 666 Fifth Avenue, which was a building at one point owned by Jared Kushner, and interestingly, the name was eventually changed to 660 Fifth Avenue to get rid of those satanic connotations, but we all know it's a possible epicenter of evil, possibly a gateway to hell, and that could have been an interesting little topic here. And I could have just talked about the devil and evil in general, which of course could have been interesting too. I could have examined at least one specific major apocalyptic claim, like, the Armageddon, Doomsday, or whatever. Something like that. I could have talked about hell, maybe heaven. I could have debunked them from an atheistic standpoint, pointed out how hell is a dumb concept that would not withstand scrutiny, and, make fun of heaven as a concept as well, and possibly offended the religious types out there. And, I could have talked about my favorite conventionally evil characters overall, possibly including depictions of the devil in fiction. And that's ultimately kind of what I'm doing here, although I'm narrowing my focus down to a specific film. The Omen. That's a fun topic. Also, have you ever bought something in the store and had it cost $6.66? Isn't that fun? It's kind of corny and cheesy, and I'm an atheist, but I still feel a sort of irrational and minor sense of accomplishment when that happens. And I even kind of like it when it's just a penny off from 666, which happens sometimes too. I always have to comment to the cashier about how my purchase is just shy of being evil. But let's get to the topic and talk about The Omen, the 1976 supernatural horror film that helped shape the horror world. And it doesn't rely so much on gore. It does have a few cheap scares in it, perhaps, but it doesn't rely that much on cheap scares. It's more of an atmospheric film, and that's sometimes the type of horror that I'm in the mood for. It's the kind of movie that creeps up on you. It's quiet, controlled, and by the time it shows its hand, you already feel like something is deeply wrong. So let's start with the basics. The movie was directed by Richard Donner, who would later become known for some major action films, but here he takes a very restrained approach. Well, pretty restrained anyway. The cast includes Gregory Peck, Lee Remick, who is, she's gorgeous, beautiful, a babe, whatever you want to call her. I'm sure some people would be like, "You're being sexist," but Gregory Peck, he's a good-looking fella too. I'm not gonna totally leave that unnoticed. And you also have a young Harvey Stevens as Damien. You also get strong supporting roles from David Warner, Billy Whitelaw, Patrick Troughton, I believe that's how that's pronounced, or Troughton, and Holly Palance as the unforgettable nanny. And the music was composed by Jerry Goldsmith. He's a huge part of why the film works. He won an Academy Award for it, and you can hear why. The score, especially the track Ave Satani, feels almost like a ritual. It's not just background music, it's the atmosphere. It's almost like a character unto itself. And I'm going to eventually probably do an episode on Jerry Goldsmith, and I'll even touch upon the fact that he did some music for some porno movies, apparently, at least according to IMDb. But I'm going to leave that alone for now. So, what's the story for the Omen? Without spoiling anything major, it follows an American diplomat named Robert Thorne. After his child dies at birth, he secretly adopts another baby to spare his wife the pain, and the child is named Damien. And I'm sure that ever since this movie came out, you had parents like, "Well, I'm not going to name my kid Damien after all of these satanic connotations from this movie." And you also had some sort of rebel parents, probably, who were more likely to name their son Damien after this movie. And surely enough, some of them probably did because they like the idea. They like the idea of uh, mockingly having a child named after sort of a demon boy. And as Damien grows up, well, they don't really depict him growing up so much in the movie, but as he gets a little older, strange things start happening. Not just odd, but sometimes violent, unexplainable. And Thorn gets harassed repeatedly by a man who seems like some random crazy priest. And he at first dismisses the priest as a crazy person with unsettling ramblings about Damien. However, as these strange and tragic events unfold, Thorne begins to suspect that something is seriously wrong, and the film slowly pulls you into that realization with him. Maybe that priest actually was not so crazy. Isn't that just the way? He sure seems like a nut job, but what if? It's one of those stories like what if you were thrust into this world and a person who initially seemed crazy was actually really onto something? What if they're actually being the voice of reason as your own reality kind of unfolds in a crazy way? And what makes The Omen stand out is how it handles fear, paranoia, and a clash of ideas, emotions, and events. It's really kind of a tragic story here, and it doesn't rush. It takes its time, yet it doesn't really drag on either. It's got really good pacing. It's considered a bit of a slow burn movie, but it's not, at least in my opinion, it's not boring. I always found it to be something that keeps my attention. It doesn't throw jump scares at you every few minutes either. Instead, it builds tension through atmosphere, imagery, and a constant sense of dread. There's a heavy use of religious symbolism, and the idea of prophecy hangs over everything. You're not just watching events unfold, you feel like they were always going to happen. And that's another kind of twisted aspect of this movie. Like, how much of reality is fate? And that's sort of a topic that's interesting unto itself. So if you're a real deep thinker, you might come out of this movie wondering, like, how different could the world have been if just certain events had not occurred? There's this element of what if to this movie too. So even though the story is straightforward, it still has that feeling of a show don't tell kind of film. You're given all the pieces, and it's not much of a mystery outright, but the story is still mysterious and strange. Like I said, there's that what if component to it. You might ask yourself, like, how different might my life be if this thing had not happened? And the story has the sort of inherent logic that most of these quality supernatural stories would require in order for us to actually follow along and understand them. And usually you need to be able to grasp the basics of a story in order for it to be good. There are exceptions to that. Like there are some movies where the visual elements are just so captivating that the plot holes of the story aren't so much of a big deal. You can still enjoy the movie anyway. But this movie, thankfully, it does have that internal logic. So even though the story is crazy and wild and strange, it still makes sense enough for it to be enjoyed in a conventional manner. Well, I guess most people wouldn't enjoy it in a way, but I've always been weird about movies like this. I'm able to actually enjoy them in a sense, call it my dark humor or whatever, but I get entertained a little bit by movies like this. So otherwise, a movie like this might be just too weird, too abstract, and it might just be random images and events. But this is a cohesive story. Here you are taken along for a crazy ride, but somehow you're able to follow along. I think that with a less skilled director at the helm, movies like this could easily fall apart. They could be too muddled, maybe just too dumb or boring or whatever. But I think there was an element of genius to The Omen, and that's what makes it one of the great horror films of all time. And The Omen is a smart movie instead of a dumb one, basically. There are definitely moments that people remember. Even if you haven't seen the movie, you've probably heard about the birthday party scene with the nanny. It's one of those lines and images that stuck in pop culture for a reason. It's just a creepy scene. It's very dark. And the film also became known for its creative and shocking death scenes, like a particularly infamous decapitation. But what really grounds the film is Gregory Peck. He does a really great job in this movie. His performance as Robert Thorne gives the movie weight. He doesn't play it as a typical horror protagonist. He plays it as a man trying to stay rational while everything around him just collapses. You can see the conflict that's sort of circulating in his eyes and in his mind. He wants to disbelieve what he's seeing, but he can't ignore it anymore. And that tension between logic and fear is really a key part of what carries the film. There's also an emotional layer that makes it hit a lot harder. Gregory Peck had actually experienced personal loss not long before filming this movie, and that sense of grief and strain, I think, comes through. It makes the story feel less like fantasy and more like a psychological unraveling. And I think, there's a part of a movie like this that might risk having you having a bit of a psychological unraveling of your own. You might be thinking about loss of family in your own life, and that's something that might hit harder if you've experienced loss like that. So I suppose a movie like this might even be a bit of a tough watch for some people. So it's one of those things that's going to hit different people in different ways. And the dynamic between Gregory Peck and Lee Remick also adds to this. As his wife begins to break down, his restraint becomes even more important. It keeps the film grounded even when things get extreme. He tries to be a voice of reason, but after a while, the extreme events just start to take their toll, and you get the sense that he really almost has no choice by a certain point. He's just dragged along into the craziness. And as as all that happens, you start to get dragged along too, in the best sort of way, at least in my experience. And when this movie came out, The Omen was both a box office success and well received by critics, which is definitely something that does not always happen. A lot of movies like The Thing, for example, John Carpenter's The Thing, that was critically lampooned at the time, but of course, it's now considered more of an more of a classic, but at the time it was pretty panned by the critics out there. But this movie is right in the middle of a 1970s wave of religious and occult horror alongside films like The Exorcist. And this one carved out its own identity in a way that even a lot of the critics felt was great. Instead of focusing on things like possession, it has the idea of inevitability or fate and the fear that something has already been set in motion and cannot be stopped. And that idea stuck and it really struck a chord with people. And the film's success, of course, spawned a franchise that includes three sequels: Damien Omen 2 from 1978, Omen 3 The Final Conflict in 1981, and Omen IV The Awakening in 1996. Now, I think I've only seen Omen 2 of that bunch, and I really don't remember it that well. I remember it being not abysmally bad, but I don't really remembered a whole lot. But you also had the first Omen that came out in 2024, which is actually a surprisingly good prequel movie. So I kind of recommend that one, with the warning that you might not like it as much as the original version of, or the original The Omen. You always got to include the possibility that a person might just not like it as much. Obviously, I don't know what your taste in movies is. You might love the first Omen, you might hate it, but I thought it was actually surprisingly good, given the challenge that a movie would have if they're trying to make a prequel to a classic like this. So you almost have to give it a little bit of leniency for that reason. And then there's the 2006 remake starring Liev Schreiber and Julia Stiles. Now, that movie, plenty of people seem to hate that one. I thought it was okay, you know, just like I think a lot of movies are okay that a lot of people might hate. But I just didn't connect with it that much. I mean, Julia Stiles, she's also a pretty lady, so that doesn't hurt the movie. But it's just not as good as the original. I mean, I'll just leave it like that. You know, Putting my potential crush on Julia Stiles aside, I don't think she necessarily saves that movie. It's just something that I find tolerable. I'm able to watch it, but it's not like a masterpiece. I might review that at some point for the podcast because I think it might deserve another viewing, and I think it might be interesting to see what I can talk about with that movie. But another thing about The Omen is that it helped define the evil child subgenre, influencing countless films that came after. You've got, movies like The Good Son, which probably, thematically borrowed some elements from this movie, even though it's definitely not quite the same. And you've got The Orphan, which has some of that evil child charm, but also a lot of movies have this satanic child element, and it's a fun little subgenre, and people still come back to this movie because it's got so many different elements going on to it. The atmosphere, the performances. There's also something deeper going on. There's a theory mentioned in a book called The Body Keeps the Score that strong emotional experiences can actually dull physical pain by triggering the brain's own chemical responses and stuff like that. And I think that sometimes, you know, is a part of what is going on when we watch movies. They're a little bit like drug experiences. They create such intense emotional tension that your body reacts to it, and it might be a little bit like a drug. It might seem weird to gain some relief by watching others' misfortune unfolding on the screen, but I've watched The Omen so many times that honestly I almost cannot watch it that often anymore for fear that I might just become too numb to its effects. I have to kind of step away from movies like this because I just don't feel the same if I've seen them too many times. And this has happened to me with numerous other movies, especially in the horror genre. I'm at risk of watching some movies too often, like this one, as well as like Nightmare on Elm Street 3, The Dream Warriors, or even those silly Friday the 13th movies. Sometimes I have to give these movies a break, in order for them to stay at all effective. And that's because you're not just watching a story here, you're feeling it in a way. And I don't want those feelings to be too dulled from overly repeated use. Know what I mean? And I think when it comes to a movie like this, I might feel like I've had my senses dulled over the years because I've seen them so many times, but there's probably still a part of me that's deeply affected. And I just don't notice it at first. But there are some lingering long term effects. And if you're someone who prefers horror that lingers instead of only being shocking, then I think The Omen is probably worth your time. It's not about what jumps out at you, it's about what stays with you after the credits roll. And I definitely still love this movie, even though, like I said, I have to give it a break every so often. So that's about it for today's episode. I probably didn't do this movie justice in this review. If you've seen The Omen, I'd be curious what stuck with you the most. Was it the music, the performances, or just that constant sense that something wasn't right? Well, thanks for listening, and have a good day. May your day not be totally tainted by the evils of the world.